Alex and Melissa had been married for 8 years, a relationship Alex often joked was built on playful banter and a teenage crush. By the time he reached 30, Melissa had just turned 27, and they welcomed their first child, a son. That little boy had recently turned 3 and started preschool. Meanwhile, Melissa had finally returned to work after her maternity leave. During her absence, many changes had taken place at her company, the most significant being a new director taking charge. When she met him for the first time, she was struck by his presence. His name was Peter, and he was nearly a decade older than her. Fresh out of maternity leave and craving adult interaction, especially male attention, Melissa couldn't deny the flattery that came with Peter's obvious flirtation. She played along, careful not to cross any serious boundaries, but it was clear that Peter had no such reservations. For a month, the flirtation continued, harmless enough on the surface, yet undeniably charged. Then, one day, Peter called her into his office. As soon as he locked the door, he made his intentions clear. Melissa didn't resist. In fact, she was intrigued, though she made a show of hesitating. From that moment on, every interaction with her boss left her feeling both exhilarated and uneasy. Whenever they crossed paths, her cheeks warmed with embarrassment. She avoided his gaze, stumbling over her words. To the rest of the staff, Peter was unexpectedly strict with her, but behind closed doors, he always found an excuse to touch her, a playful pinch, a lingering hand on her back. One evening, long after most employees had left, the two remained alone in his office. Peter stood by the window, smoking, while Melissa quietly finished getting dressed. "Don't take it personally when I talk tough to you in front of everyone," he said suddenly. Melissa buttoned her blouse, barely sparing him a glance. "I figured as much. You're just being cautious." "Exactly," he muttered, stubbing out a cigarette. "I promised my wife I'd be home on time." Those last words, "my wife," hit Melissa harder than she expected. Yes, she had a husband and child waiting for her too, but hearing Peter mention his spouse so casually made something inside her twist. Pressing her lips together, she gathered her things in silence. Lately, her late nights at work had started raising suspicions. Alex, who had never been the jealous type, was growing uneasy. He questioned her constantly, asking why she suddenly had to stay so late when she never used to. His concern turned into frequent calls throughout the day, making sure she was actually at the office. Melissa found his sudden need to track her every move suffocating. One evening, when he called yet again, her patience snapped. "Stop calling me so much," she hissed into the phone, lowering her voice so no one around would hear. "You're embarrassing me. I'm worried about you." Alex would shout over the phone. "Then worry about your son instead." Melissa would snap back before abruptly ending the call. Frustrated, she'd mutter under her breath about how exhausted she was with his constant nagging. More than once, the stress got to her. After heated arguments with Alex, she would find herself breaking down in tears at the office, only to have Peter reprimand her publicly in front of their coworkers. Humiliated, she would lock herself in the bathroom, sobbing while well-meaning colleagues offered sympathy, never realizing she was the one fueling her own chaos. One particularly rough day, Peter asked her to stay late and complete some reports. Still seething from his earlier harsh words, she refused outright. Everything was closing in. The constant fights with Alex, the shame of being scolded like a child in front of everyone. What once felt thrilling now felt suffocating, a never-ending cycle of misery disguised as excitement. Peter looked taken aback by her defiance. He stepped closer, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You don't get to refuse me," he murmured. Melissa's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "Yeah? And what exactly are you going to do about it?" she shot back, blinking rapidly to keep her tears at bay. His response was devastatingly calm. "What will I do? I'll tell your dear husband everything. Every single detail, including that cute little birthmark in a very private spot." Melissa's stomach dropped. He was enjoying this, relishing the power he had over her. "Tonight you'll stay," Peter announced loud enough for others nearby to hear before walking off, leaving her standing there, ghostly pale and gripping the edge of her desk just to keep herself upright. His words echoed in her mind, freezing her in place. By the time she managed to pull herself together, the last of her co-workers had already left for the evening. As she shakily got up to leave, her phone rang. Alex, could this get any worse? Scoffing at the absurdity of it all, she declined the call. She'd just tell him later that her phone had been buried in her purse. Peter was waiting for her in his office. Gone was the charming illusion she once admired. In its place stood a smug, self-satisfied predator who believed he had her cornered. His grin was that of a fox who had successfully trapped its prey. "Smart girl," he said smoothly. "You made the right choice." Melissa swallowed hard. "Aren't you even a little worried?" "I'll tell your wife," Melissa threatened, though her voice wavered. Peter chuckled, completely unfazed. "You really think she doesn't already know? She's fine with this arrangement. Money talks, sweetheart." Melissa had no response. Deep down, she hadn't expected that threat to work anyway. Meanwhile, back in her abandoned office, her phone continued buzzing, Alex's name flashing on the screen. At that very moment, he was already on his way to her workplace, his mind running wild with worst-case scenarios. He pictured storming in and catching her with some stranger, and that mental image only stoked his fury. He was convinced she was lying. A few weeks ago, he'd noticed a faint bruise on her shoulder, and her excuse about a heavy gym bag, causing it had never sat right with him. When he arrived at the building, he strode straight to the security desk. "I'm here to pick up my wife," he told the guard before making his way upstairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though invisible weights were dragging him down. His pulse pounded so fiercely it nearly drowned out his thoughts. Stopping at the office door, he gripped the handle, inhaling deeply, forcing himself to steady his shaking hands. Then, with a surge of determination, he pushed it open. The hallway lights were still on, casting a dim glow of the quiet office. His eyes landed on Melissa's desk. Her belongings were still there, her phone lying in plain sight, but she was nowhere to be seen. Then he heard it, muted sounds coming from a back office. The door was slightly ajar, a strange, rhythmic thumping. His stomach clenched. Moving carefully, he approached. As the noises became clearer, something inside him snapped. Without hesitation, he kicked the door open. The sight before him made his entire body lock up. Melissa was perched on a cluttered desk, papers scattered around her. The man in the crisp white dress shirt, her boss, he realized, stood between her legs. Startled, Peter jerked back, fumbling to pull up his pants. A raw, animalistic sound tore from Alex's throat before he lunged. His fist flew, landing hard and fast. Peter fought back, the two men grappling violently. Melissa screamed, trying to wedge herself between them, desperate to pull them apart. In a final effort, she threw her arms around Alex's neck, yanking him away from her boss. And that's when Alex finally saw her face. Tear-streaked, mascara smeared, lipstick smudged. She looked completely wrecked. Without a word, they left. The drive home was suffocating, thick with a silence more punishing than any argument. Alex dabbed at his bleeding lip with a crumpled tissue. Peter had gotten a few good hits in, but that wasn't what stung the most. What burned deeper than any bruise was the woman sitting beside him, the woman he no longer recognized. He couldn't stand the sight of her. If he could have made her disappear in that moment, he would have. Melissa, on the other hand, longed to curl into his arms, to beg for forgiveness, to explain. But neither got what they wanted. Alex filed for divorce immediately. Melissa pleaded with him, sobbing into the phone, promising she'd change, swearing it would never happen again. But Alex was done. His decision was final. Humiliation followed her everywhere. The rumors about her affair spread like wildfire at work, and Peter, wanting to wash his hands of scandal, pressured her to resign. With no job, no husband, and no reputation left to salvage, her world crumbled. The only thing keeping her from collapsing entirely was her son. No matter how shattered she felt, she still had to be his mother. Night after night, after Alex had cut all contact, she found herself thinking about him. Only then did her mother's old words ring painfully true. You never cherish what you have until it's gone. And by then, all you can do is cry.